As darkness descends upon the forbidden city, the flame of candles dances across the cold vermilion walls, snatching a trembling silhouette from the gloom. A woman, wrapped in a blanket, crawls silently toward the emperor's bed. Outside, the measured footsteps of a eunuch echo like the rhythm of fate itself. Here, no one was permitted to draw a deep breath. No one was permitted to love. And no one was permitted to choose. This is the imperial harem of the Qing Dynasty, a place where every night was a game of mortal chess, every imperial visit a gamble for a new life, and every concubine merely a carved name among 3,000 beauties. In this world, glory and humiliation were two sides of the same coin. So, what truly happened behind the thin silk curtain when the monarch's favor became a weapon and affection an unaffordable luxury? And who was the true victor in this silent, gilded cage? In the Qing Dynasty harem, life was governed by an order so strict it bordered on paranoia, from the hierarchy of ranks down to the most minor details of daily life. This was especially true of the emperor's visit, a procedure that seemed intimate but was in fact a cold state ritual. Picture this. Every evening after dinner, eunuchs would bring the emperor a tray of small wooden planks, the so-called name tags. A concubine's name was carved on each one. A simple flick of the emperor's wrist, turning over a single tag decided a woman's fate. You might think this was like winning the lottery, right? Wrong. This was only the beginning of a suffocating ceremony in which a woman had no right to her emotions or the right to refuse. Once you were chosen, you were immediately taken for a full bathing, your body perfumed, your hair combed smooth. But after the bath, you were not allowed to dress. Instead, you were completely enveloped in a thick blanket and told to wait, motionless. At that moment, you ceased to be a person. You became a package. When the eunuchs arrived, they would silently carry this bundle to the emperor's chambers. You were forbidden from walking on your own. At the foot of the bed, you were set down, and you had to crawl onto the bed from the end, starting at the emperor's feet. A demonstration of your humility and absolute submission. During intimacy, you could not make a sound. No jewelry or personal items were allowed, partly for fear of an assassination attempt on the Son of Heaven, partly for total control. And in this supposedly intimate moment, there were 3 parties present: the emperor, the concubine, and 12 eunuchs who silently observed the proceedings. Even the duration of the visit was not unlimited. As soon as the clock struck the designated hour, eunuchs outside the door would loudly call out, reminding the emperor that his time was up. If there was no response, they would shout louder and more insistently until a signal was given. Afterwards, the concubine would once again wrap herself in the blanket, crawl off the bed the same way she got on, and be carried back to her palace. But the ceremony of humiliation wasn't over. Did you know that the retention of the imperial seed was not always permitted? After every encounter, the eunuchs would ask the emperor a single specific question: should it be kept? This question, in essence, was an inquiry as to whether the emperor wished for the concubine to become pregnant. If the emperor answered no, the eunuchs would begin a blood-chilling procedure. They would apply firm pressure to a specific acupressure point on the concubine's abdomen, and then continuously massage the area to expel all of the semen. This was all done to ensure that no offspring were conceived without explicit intent. It sounds like a medical procedure, but in reality, this was a moment when some eunuchs would revel in their power, humiliating the concubines. They touched their bodies, manipulated them, yet the women dared not resist. A single complaint from them could mean they would never again be granted the emperor's favor. For these women, a visit was their only chance to elevate their status. To lose that opportunity meant a life of cold, lonely obscurity until death. But the intelligent concubines knew how to use this very moment to bargain with the eunuchs in exchange for another night's opportunity, or for a message to be passed to the emperor. In the harem, cunning was a vital weapon. If you couldn't rely on beauty, you had to possess a sharp mind to survive. It was for this very reason that for many women of that era, being chosen was not an honor, but a humiliation. It was the moment of being transformed into a commodity, packaged, delivered, and then discarded, like an object. Even the seemingly small privilege of spending the entire night with the emperor was reserved exclusively for the empress. All other concubines, no matter how favored, were merely temporary guests in his bedchamber. Furthermore, if a concubine committed any infraction, such as making a sound during intimacy or bringing in jewelry, the punishment was severe. It could range from imprisonment and flogging to demotion to the rank of a servant, or being sent to the cold palace to wither away in darkness. So love in the imperial palace, if you could even call it that, was a fragile illusion. Concubines had no right to love. They only had the right to be chosen, to wait, and to hope for a single night of imperial favor that could alter their destiny. But the price for that hope was humiliation, pain, and countless risks. And it all began with a small wooden plank, with that seemingly simple name tag that held a woman's entire fate. If you believe that all the concubines in the palace eagerly awaited an imperial visit, think again. There were times when being chosen was equivalent to a death sentence, especially during the Red Days. For modern women, menstruation is a normal part of life, but in feudal society, it was considered unclean, a sign of a bad omen. For the emperor, the son of heaven, encountering blood during intimacy was a grave taboo. Therefore, if a concubine was unfortunately summoned precisely when her body was inconvenient, the consequences could be catastrophic. At best, she would fall out of favor forever. At worst, she could be beheaded for the crime of disrespecting the emperor. Thus, in a world where women's bodies were controlled down to the finest detail, they were forced to devise countless schemes to avoid a summons on unfavorable days. One of the common methods was a daring gambit known as stealing the dragon to replace the phoenix. In other words, using someone else to take one's place in the emperor's bed. It sounds audacious, and it was. But imagine that the number of concubines in the harem reached into the hundreds, even thousands. Many were recruited into the palace at a young age, looked similar, and didn't appear before the emperor often. It was difficult for him to remember them all. If a concubine wasn't a frequent favorite, the likelihood of the emperor recognizing her was very low. Thus, there were instances where a concubine escaped a night of intimacy by having a palace maid of similar appearance crawl onto the emperor's bed in her stead. Of course, this could only happen if the eunuchs in charge of the name tags were bribed to look the other way. But what if they were discovered? Both the imposter and the conspiring concubine would be executed for deceiving the Son of Heaven. That is why, although this trick existed, few dared to use it. And if they did, it was a gamble with their lives. A more subtle and skillful method involved using secret signals to inform the emperor that one was inconvenient. During the Han Dynasty, it was recorded that menstruating concubines would wear a gold ring whose name was a homophone for a phrase subtly implying, "I am on my period." If the emperor was perceptive, he would immediately understand and bypass that person's name tag. During the Tang Dynasty, the method became even more discreet. Each concubine had her visitation schedule arranged in a rotating roster. If it was her turn and it coincided with her period, the concubine would simply place a red dot on her face, a subtle sign for the female officials to know that she could not serve the emperor that night. The matter would be rearranged without any fuss. Fast forward to the Qing Dynasty, which is believed to have had the most rigorous harem rules. A special agency was established to manage the imperial visitation name tags. During menstruation, concubines were required to inform the eunuchs of this agency in advance. The official in charge would remove that concubine's name tag from the list, thus avoiding an awkward situation. It helped save face for both parties and allowed the harem to operate smoothly without scandals. But despite these protective measures, it was not always easy to refuse the emperor. In reality, the Son of Heaven was, after all, the ruler of a nation. If he chose you for that night, refusing him was incredibly difficult. It would not only offend the emperor's dignity, but could also lead to perpetual disfavor. Therefore, these clever and discreet tricks were akin to the art of survival for women in the Deep Palace. Those who knew how to use them preserved their bodies. Those who were clumsy or foolish not only lost opportunities, but also easily lost their lives. One little noticed fact was that these strict rules were only truly effective when the emperor was in the Forbidden City. When the emperor left the capital, traveled to the mountains to escape the heat, or moved to other imperial residences, these visitation regulations could be relaxed or completely disregarded. At such times, intimate encounters became more natural, somewhat more spontaneous. No name tags, no rituals. Inspiration alone was enough. It was then that concubines caught a glimpse of light in their otherwise rigid and suffocating palace lives. But alas, such occasions were as rare as falling stars, lasting only a few weeks each year. The imperial harem was ultimately not a dreamland from ancient silk paintings. It was a world where people were treated as chess pieces. Every step, every word had to be calculated. Beauty was a weapon, intelligence was a shield, and sometimes silent cunning was what helped them survive. This is to make you understand. Living in the imperial harem was not living, but merely existing. And to exist, every concubine had to learn to use schemes, even accept humiliation, just to preserve another opportunity for herself in the future, no matter how faint. If the schemes, rituals, and rules of the imperial harem can make later generations feel suffocated, then delving deeper we realize an even colder truth. For a concubine, being favored was not just a night with the emperor, but a life-or-death gamble, where her fate was staked on every drop of the imperial seed, every glance from the Son of Heaven, and every vague decision made in a fleeting moment by a man who held the world in his hands. After each imperial visit, if the emperor intended to allow conception, the concubine would be meticulously recorded in official ledgers. Date, month, year, specific time, the person responsible, and the emperor's confirmation. Every line in that ledger was not merely a record of an intimate encounter, but a contract for a potential future, for power, and for the opportunity to ascend to the highest rank in the harem. Because if the child born was a prince and officially recognized as a legitimate heir, the mother's status would change overnight. From an ordinary concubine, she could become a noble lady, a consort, or even an imperial noble consort. But if it was not recorded, if it was not kept, or if she failed to conceive, then all efforts, all hopes would vanish like a dream. That is why, after each time the emperor decided not to retain the seed, the eunuchs would employ coercive measures. They would press hard on acupressure points on the lower abdomen, using their hands to massage the semen out. This sounds callous, but it was a mandatory step to preserve the purity of the imperial bloodline. It was also an indirect way for the court to control reproduction and power within the palace. More horrifyingly, some eunuchs exploited this very process to violate and abuse the concubines' bodies. They didn't need to touch them in a sexual manner. Simply prolonging the processing time, deliberately touching and getting close, was enough to assert their power. Most concubines dared not resist. They knew that if they caused trouble, the consequences would not stop at losing the chance to conceive an imperial child, but could also mean being banished to the cold palace, or being forever ignored by the emperor. In that intricate tapestry, each concubine became a chess piece that had to find her own way to move, whether slowly, silently, or painfully.
For this reason, some would resort to any means to retain the imperial seed, even defying the emperor's orders. A few concubines, after being massaged, would try to retain some of it or try to prevent the eunuchs from approaching. Some even tried to swap towels, beds, or conceal the timing to secretly preserve the possibility of conception. But such tricks could also be discovered, and if caught red-handed, the price to pay was no different from treason. Flogging, torture, or even execution for having improper intentions with the imperial bloodline. Some chose to resist, some chose to endure, and some chose to negotiate with the eunuchs. It may sound unbelievable, but in the world of the imperial harem, a complex, unspoken relationship existed between concubines and eunuchs. Some of them even became secret allies, helping concubines record their conception times, assisting them when they faced jealousy, or creating opportunities for them to approach the emperor again. In return, the concubines had to be sensible, sending gifts, promising positions for relatives outside the palace, or even allowing themselves to be touched within bearable limits. A concubine who wanted to be favored multiple times had to understand the rules of the game. The more imperial visits, the higher the probability of pregnancy, and once the imperial seed was conceived, everything would change. Therefore, many were willing to remain silent when abused by eunuchs or actively bribe them in exchange for an opportunity. In the dark corners of the sleeping quarters, behind the faint silk curtains, those women not only fought to survive, but also had to fight their own humiliation. Every night of an imperial visit was not just about flesh and blood, but a life or death chess move in the game for favor, where love was a luxury and true emotions were taboo.
It was also for this reason that whenever a concubine legally became pregnant, the eunuchs meticulously recorded it in official ledgers, the person's name, date, time, and health status. This was not only to verify the bloodline, but also for future cross-referencing if there were disputes over the throne. Can you imagine a child not yet born subjected to such harsh scrutiny? Its mother dared not breathe heavily, dared not leave the palace for a moment because every action could be deemed to have ulterior motives. A big yawn could be considered disrespectful. In conclusion, the imperial harem during the Qing Dynasty was a massive machine, where every gear operated according to rigid and harsh rules. Within it, women had no right to control their own bodies, were not allowed to love, were not allowed to refuse, and sometimes were not allowed to live if they made a mistake. Was being chosen for an imperial visit a stroke of luck or a misfortune? Was being favored a form of glory or a set of shackles? Perhaps only the women who lived in the shadows of the Forbidden City truly understood, and we, living in modern times, can only listen as if to the haunting whispers echoing from a distant past, where human lives were crushed under layers of vermilion and gold.